Hello and welcome back to my channel. My name is David Novak. I've done a couple of videos recently about history. Just a couple of days ago, reading history, in which I talked about my experience with reading history. And about a week or so before that, another about 10 historians with stellar prose. And I continue to think about the topic. I've been reading Mark Edward Lewis. The sticker is underneath the plastic cover, so I haven't been able to remove it. And thoughts continue to arise. While I was looking at this book, I came across a little illustration, and if you look way down at the bottom, it mentions it is adapted or taken from another book about the Han Dynasty, written by, I can't read it in reverse here, but translated by Chang. And Chang was a very important historian to me in my early days. Mark Edward Lewis did not have any books out. Well, I read one, Sanctioned Violence, and there may have been others that were unavailable or I wouldn't have found them. But at any rate, he did not at that time offer the kind of history that I was looking for. This volume is part of a series produced by Harvard University Press. And Lewis wrote the first 3 volumes of it, so it's going to give you, or give me hopefully, a good overview of dynastic China. And there are 3 subsequent volumes written by other authors. But this wasn't available at the time, and I found nothing. But I did find Chang, and I liked him. And I've spent so many videos talking about Moses Finley. And I thought, well, he was my number 1 historian, my first historian, I said. My second historian was Bernard Lewis, and my third historian was Chang, even though he was actually an archaeologist. I couldn't find history. And when I say that, I am very specifically talking about the fact that these were writers that I trusted. And I don't know how it goes with history now. So much information is available online. But in the old days, when it was primarily a thing that one picked up from books, books were hard to find. And so you wanted to find authors in which you could place a bit of confidence, or I would say trust. I always wanted to have authors that I felt a degree of trust with. So Moses Finley was certainly that, and these other authors that I have up here also are. And I thought I would just go through their books a little bit and talk about them. This book was really my introduction into history. I didn't know a thing about it, and it set me on a path toward trying to learn about Greece primarily, but I was always interested in other geographic locations. And so for the Middle East, I was a reader of Bernard Lewis. For Africa, Basil Davidson, or Basil, I'm not sure how you would say that. And of course, I've talked about Chang. I never grouped Davidson with my, I don't know, cardinal historians. I've read all of these books I have by him, but while his writing is good, I'm not so sure that his history is, and I don't remember very much from what he wrote. So that's a signal right there. When I talk about trusting historians, I've mentioned this a couple of times on my channel, the caning of Charles Sumner. I wanted to learn about that incident, and I came across this book by William James Hull Hoffer, and it's an atrocious book because it is not really a book of history. It's history written from the standpoint of the lost cause myth. And so you read this book, and the conclusion that you come to is that Charles Sumner was almost murdered on the Senate floor, because how could any reasonable person restrain himself from wailing upon that man because of his insistence of talking about slavery all the time? So he had it coming to him. That's what this book says. I eventually went and read the letters of Charles Sumner in a 2-volume set. Very dry reading, just because I wanted to get down to the bottom of the caning incident. So finding an author that you trust is real important. Nowadays, so much is available on websites, and there again, you have to find a website or authors that you trust. I think it may be harder to do. So I'm not going to do this as a how-to, how to find an author that you trust, but I really want to give K.C. Chang his due, and so I'll just go through these other books possibly fairly quickly. I've mentioned that Bernard Lewis was a important starting place for me. The very first book of his that I found was The Arabs in History. I believe this says revised edition somewhere. Yeah, revised edition. I believe it came out later in a revised and expanded edition, which I saw somewhere. This was very nice, less than 200 pages. And early on in the book, he makes the distinction. He says this is not a history of the Arabs. He said it's about the Arabs in history. And that's the kind of distinction that I always appreciate a historian making. If I ever, I've seen the larger version of this, and I believe it is expanded. I'm not 100% sure on that, but if I see it again someday, I will pick it up and consider giving this a reread. So that was my first book with Bernard Lewis. I've talked about Finley in so many places. I think I have a whole book devoted, a whole video devoted to Finley. If I think of it, I'll put a link to that as well. So let me just show you the ones I've read, I guess. I've read the Semites and Anti-Semites. I've read about the assassins. And the political language of Islam. I talked about that one in the 10 writers of impeccable prose or whatever. And then this one I've talked about as well. So I think those might be the only ones of his that I have read. My current partner owned, independently, she owned, I forgot to mention this. This was probably the second of Lewis's books which I bought and read. It sort of dovetailed with Moses Finley, and so spurred my interest in the history of slavery. But my partner had several of these books, and others I just picked up here and there along the way, thinking if ever I wanted to read them, I might. I've now that I've finished reading about the church in Turkey after the fall of Constantinople by Stephen Runciman, I've thought this would be a good follow-up to that, because it begins with the emergence of modern Turkey. And so that may well be on my list. So these other books, a Middle Eastern Mosaic, I think this was my partner's. And this, I am not sure. Come to think of it, I think I picked up something else recently, and it's not here. I didn't even think about it. And I also, last year, read, Lewis did a memoir, and I read that. It was a very nice historian's memoir. So, the Middle East, I believe she owned this one. They've sort of been transferred over to my bookshelf now. And Faith and Power. I'm going to guess it's selected essays. Yeah. I'm going to bet that I read some of these essays in The American Scholar. Lewis was frequently published in there, and multiple identities of the Middle East. I'm not sure. And one or another of these might be a revised version of one that I just showed. I can't remember anymore. And then with the felling of the Twin Towers in New York City on September 11th, 2001, Lewis became much in demand, and he wrote books of this sort. What Went Wrong? I mean, that was $2. That's why I left the price on there. And there's at least another one. I don't know if he was just trying to capitalize upon current events. And he was consulted by the neocons to help shape their policy. How much they listened to him, I don't know. But I am not as interested in the Middle East as I may be in some other geographic locales in the world, and one can only read so much unless one is a certain booktuber that would read this of an evening. But that's Bernard Lewis. I will show you Davidson's books, but as I say, and I've read all of these. Africa in History, though I did not read the revised and expanded edition. Probably of the books of his that I read, I think I liked that one the best. Black Man's Burden, not to be confused by the book by E.D. Morel with the same title. The African Genius, The African Slave Trade. I mean, back in the day, this was all you could find. The Fortunate Isles, and then this search for Africa. It was all that you could. It was all that you could find in the store, and even before that, I had an interest in Africa, and the only book anywhere had been a one-volume history of Africa by J.D. Fage and another writer. I can't remember the name of the other writer, and I read that, not comprehending it all, but tried to put a history of Africa from time immemorial into one slim paperback, and it was no wonder that I didn't get much out of it. And so when I discovered him, he was the best thing available. But I never, and I trust him well enough. I don't think he is deceitful or disingenuous at all. I just, I don't know. He just. As far as Africa, I would like to find a historian that I liked to the degree that I like K.C. Chang, Bernard Lewis, and M.I. Finley, but have never done so. But still, he deserves a mention because he was important to me. Now, K.C. Chang was an archaeologist, and I find archaeology very hard reading. So the first book of his that I found, which has dulled a lot, the spine used to be the same color as the front. So Art, Myth, and Ritual, and it probably was my first introduction to this sort of thing, and can't say that I got much out of it. I always loved the portrait of the god or man, I don't know, who invented writing. Four Eyes, you might call him, and I have used this here and again as my my avatar on different social media platforms. So that, and I think I've only otherwise read all the way through his Chang Civilization. And as I say, it's very hard going, and all of this archaeology quite probably has been superseded because so much archaeology has been done since he was writing. So it's never been a priority for me to read to read the rest of what I have by him. But just within the past year, I was in a bookstore in another city somewhere and came across this and decided to pick it up. I don't know what it is, but I think it's a selection of essays, and I'm as I say, I trust Casey Chang, and I'm very interested to hear what he has to say. So I look forward to it. When I was young, the only book that I was able to get was this book about archaeology. This, of course, would have been superseded as well, but I'm sure it's a good picture of the lay of the land in his day. And I believe that I've read a fair amount of this. I probably DNF'd it somewhere, but this kind of thing is just really hard for me to, get my head around. But I have been working to improve my reading for the last 3 years, and I hope that I will get to these at some point. The trouble with what I am doing now, as far as this has been on my shelf for a while, and I DNF'd it, did not finish it a long time ago, and so I'm revisiting it. But while I am trying to cover my backlog of books, of things that I picked up, I also am finding new things that interest me. So my progress with the old backlog is not as swift as I would like. I've read a little bit about food in Chinese culture, which probably would be the next book of his that I tackle. If you're interested in studying China, this food is a major topic there, and I don't think it's been given a lot of due. And I've read a little bit of this, and there is some really lovely writing in it, and so it is just there waiting for me. And then that book on Han civilization that I mentioned, it's by Wang Zhongshu. I don't know how you say that, but translated by Casey Chang. Let's see if I can, yeah, and collaborators. Okay, so it's a case of, I felt that a project which he was involved with would be dependable. I've always felt that about Moses Finley. So I've read book upon book written by an author that was an associate of Moses Finley, and been well repaid for for that sort of criteria in selecting a book. But some of this with Chang, if I found a more contemporary archaeologist, then I might let him go. But this was another book by him, translated, I mean by him, a different author, but translated by Chang. And I don't know if this is a counterpart to it. He had nothing to do with this, but they're both published by Yale. The one uses Wade Giles and the other uses the Pinion. I'm realizing that I just have to learn to cope with either system, but I'm sure that I picked this up after an online search, seeing that his name was attached to it. And then I don't know, I think when I saw the title, I said to myself, well, if I'm going to learn about Eastern Zhao, I guess you would say, I'm not really sure, then I should learn about Western. And I know nothing of this history. And people talk about being intimidated by history. This for Chinese history, this has been a huge intimidation for me. As we progress, more and more people are writing, more historians are coming out, more Chinese works are being translated into English. So the landscape has changed a lot from those early days when I was just groping blindly to find a clue. But for the first time in my life, since I have embarked upon the second reading of this book, I've started to put some of the big picture into perspective with China. So I think after I finish the Harvard set, if I ever do, then I could very easily attempt these two books. I'm not saying that I will, because my interests flay in so many different directions at one time. But I've found, generally speaking, that I do best with a writer whom I trust, as opposed to just willy-nilly picking up a book because the title says something that refers to the region or the time that I'm interested in, and just reading it blindly like that. I have to give the book a good look over first, and I have purchased books blindly online, and when I cracked them open, decided that I really did not like the writing style of the person. And so for me, trust is based in the writing style. I want English that is clear. There are different sort of, I guess, academic phrases that can pepper a text, and if it's too heavy, the prose by Moses Finley is a perfect starting point, because his work was acceptable to scholar and layperson alike. And it would be hard to go into detail about what it is that engenders trust in me from a text, trust with a writer. But it's really not all that different, say, to the trust one over time develops with a person who tells the truth, in contrast with a person who is lying all the time. You can pick up subtle verbal cues as to whether somebody is lying or not, but you have to be attuned to that. So if you are a novice just starting out, of course my course cannot be your course, but I found that I was served well, as with Lewis. My other book by him is called Sanctioned Violence in Early China, which I read a couple of times. Finding an author that you trust, and then just following his works, his interests, wherever they may lead you, as opposed to trying to, say, read everything about a period by different authors in whom you lack confidence, or with whom you have not built any confidence. So the cat is telling me that it is time to close this out. Thank you very much for stopping by my channel.